separation, we chose that because the wall of separation, we feel, is the thing that has made religion alive in this country. But in recent years, there have been a number of Supreme Court decisions that makes us wonder whether or not the wall is going to hold. We believe strongly in religious freedom, everybody's religious freedom. And for that reason, we thought that this would be a good topic to bring to everybody. A little bit about Alex. He's the Stephen Gay Constitutional Litigation Fellow at Americans United. He earned his Juris Doctorate magna cum laude from Georgetown Law School in Washington, was the editor of the American Criminal Law Review, a student attorney in the Appellate Litigation Clinic, and he was a member of the Barristers Council. He served as an intern in the U.S. District Court for Central District of California and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law. He's going to present for about 20 minutes or a half an hour. Following that, the members of our panel, Reverend Pastor Lynette McClellan of Hope Ministries, Rabbi Schul from Venice, the Jewish congregation, and Reverend Mike Rao from St. Mark's Episcopal Church. We will ask them for their comments. And we did not ask them for any particular thing or any particular point of view. It's totally up to them. They will give a reaction, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for your comments or your questions, whatever you like. And at this point, I'll just be quiet and turn it over to Alex.
Thanks, Rich. First of all, can everybody hear me? Yes, I see nodding heads. Okay, great. And Rich, I'm happy to report I actually can hear you when you speak directly into the microphone. So going forward, I think that will work. I know this was a ton of effort to put together the logistics, and I'm the one zooming in. So I really do appreciate all of it. And thank you for the kind introduction. So as Rich mentioned, my name is Alex. I am a litigation fellow at Americans United for Separation for Church and State, excuse me. We're the nation's longest standing organization solely dedicated to the separation of church and state. We've been at it for a little over 75 years. There are other organizations that do terrific work like the ACLU and others like that, but we are specialists in this. This is all we do. And we view our mission, as Rich really said, as protecting religious freedom for everybody. The phrase we like to use is making sure that religion is a shield and not a sword. And we do that through policy work, but we also, as Rich mentioned, do that through our legal work, which is what I'm a part of. I want to also say this is a particular pleasure for me to be speaking at a Unitarian church. I'm Jewish. My wife is Lutheran. Just over 4 years ago, we were married by my wife's close friend, who is a Unitarian minister. So anytime I get to talk to Unitarians, I feel like that, it's my people, even though I was raised Jewish. So this is a real treat for me. So thank you for having me. As Rich mentioned, I'm going to try and speak only for about 20 minutes because I know that there's other panelists who are taking time out of their day, and I want to make sure that I leave plenty of time for them and also time for questions. I'm going to try and give a sort of high-level overview of the history and the constitutional bases for the separation of church and state in the United States. So a history and a constitutional law lesson in about 20 minutes, if we can pull it off. I'll start by talking about how church-state separation got started in this country, along with some of the key Supreme Court decisions that established what were sort of thought to be well-settled norms around the separation of church and state. That largely happened in the second half of the 20th century. Then I'll talk about, as Rich mentioned, the current threats, and there are real threats, as I see them, to the continued separation between church and state. And finally, I'll close by talking a little bit about where we think all of this is headed in the future, and what people can do to help maintain the separation of church and state if they're so inclined to do so. So let me start just with the basics. What is the concept of separation of church and state? Where did it come from? And what does it mean? I think the most famous use of the line wall of separation between church and state was from an 1802 letter written by Thomas Jefferson, where he opined that was what had been enacted by the First Amendment, a wall of separation between church and state. But the concept is actually a good deal older than that. The phrase was coined in the mid-1600s by Roger Williams, who was a Baptist minister and kind of an iconoclast, an outlaw. He called for a separation of church and state, not primarily for the state's benefit, but primarily for the church's benefit. As he put it a little bit more colorfully, quote, "Forced worship stinks in God's nostrils." So that's a lot more colorful than I could come up with. But after he was actually kicked out of the Massachusetts colony for his views on church and state, they had in Massachusetts an established government religion of Puritanism. So Williams became one of the first Baptists in America, and he founded the colony of Rhode Island based primarily on the idea that individuals would and should be free to worship as they wish. But in his time, in the mid-1600s, that was certainly the minority view. That was not the view of most colonists. But over the second half of the 1600s and into the 1700s, more and more people began to adopt Roger Williams's view that there ought to be a separation between church and state. One famous example is, if you fast forward to the 1780s, Patrick Henry introduced a bill in Virginia that would have required compelled taxpayer support for the established church there, which was the Protestant church. And that bill was beaten back by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, who led a coalition of some Protestants, some Baptists, some non-religious, to say that because the religion of every man has to be left to the conviction of every man, as James Madison put it, even the forced contribution of 3 pence only was abhorrent to the proper relationship between the state and the church. So by the time that the Constitutional Convention rolled around in the late 1780s, most colonies had either disestablished their state churches and the compelled support for those churches, or they were on their way to doing so. And the federal Constitution's First Amendment, which was enacted and ratified in 1791, reflected the increasing consensus in America that church and state ought to be separate. And so that it really is just one line of the First Amendment that drives many of these issues. It says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." So for quite a while, there were very few Supreme Court decisions interpreting those two clauses, the Establishment Clause, the idea that government shouldn't be establishing a church or doing anything that would represent the establishment or favoritism of one religion over another. And then the Free Exercise Clause, the idea that people should be able to worship as they so choose. But as I mentioned, for about 150 years or so, there really were very few cases about what that meant. But by the mid-1900s, by around World War II, cases started to crop up, and the Supreme Court started to establish some what were long thought to be well-settled rules around the separation of church and state in America. And so I'm going to go through just 3 of those rules and then talk about how they're each sort of under threat today. So the first rule that the Supreme Court established is that state programs that use taxpayer money from everybody are allowed to include religious entities when they give out benefits, but they're not required to do so. So in other words, you can give money from a taxpayer program to a church if you want, if whatever state it is wants to do so, but you don't have to do that. So a couple of cases establishing this rule. There was an Everson against Board of Education. This was in 1947. And the Supreme Court held it was permissible and not an establishment of religion for New Jersey to allow students who went to private religious schools to ride public school buses, right? And the idea is, look, that public school buses, that's funded by everybody, but that's not really an establishment of religion to allow them to ride the school bus. A similar case about 55 years later, in 2002, Zellman against Simmons Harris. The state of Ohio had a voucher program where they gave, again, public taxpayer dollars to parents who could use them at any school, including religious private schools. And the Supreme Court said, that's okay, If Ohio wants to include religious schools in its program, they're allowed to. And that's not an establishment of religion. So that's the first rule, is that states could but did not have to include religious entities in taxpayer programs. The second well-established rule is that while laws could not target religious persons or entities, you couldn't disfavor religious person or entities, government could enact generally applicable laws that apply to everybody. And when they do that, they weren't required to make exemptions for religious people or entities. So the key case establishing this rule is called the Smith case. It's Smith against Oregon. It was in 1990. The state of Oregon had a law against drug use for certain drugs that applied to everybody. And an American Indian tribe sought an exemption for peyote use, which was part of their religious rituals. And the court, this was a Justice Scalia opinion, so no bleeding heart liberal. The court said, look, if Oregon wants to prohibit drug use, they can do that and they don't have to make an exception just because one group wants to use it for religious ceremonies. Then the third well-settled rule is strict strict separation, prohibiting state-led or endorsed prayer in the public schools, on the rationale that students are more impressionable than adults. And so there ought to be sort of heightened protections, a heightened wall, if you want to put it that way, of separation between church and state in public schools. So a couple of key cases in that area. In 1962, the court decided Engel against Vitale, and it barred the reading of a prayer at the start of a school day under the Establishment Clause. It said it violated the Establishment Clause because it could coerce students to pray in violation of their consciences. In 1991, in Lee against Wiseman, the court again barred a practice of inviting clergy to deliver invocations at graduation ceremonies on basically the same rationale that students were sort of a captive audience and they could be coerced. And finally, in 2000, in Santa Fe against Doe, the court barred even student prayers because those student prayers were at football games were read over the loudspeaker and were part of a program that was approved by the school. And what the court held was that, look, yes, they're student prayers, but there's a lot of government involvement between the loudspeaker and the football field and the approval of the program. And it still could coerce sort of a captive audience at a football game. So again, that third rule was that the wall of separation is at its highest in the public schools. I'm sort of excluding a whole category of cases that I just want to note, which are what I call the public display cases. That's Christmas displays or crucifixes on public property, the 10 Commandments at courthouses. The reason I'm excluding them is that there really never were any clear rules around what was or is or wasn't allowed. The Supreme Court has gone back and forth on whether, for example, the 10 Commandments is allowed to be displayed on public property. So it's hard to sort of, you could get 10 constitutional law scholars in a room and 5 of them would say one thing's constitutional and 5 of them would disagree. So it's hard to establish any rules from those cases. But you did have, as I said, those 3 bedrock rules that states could include religious entities in grant programs, but didn't have to, that there's no requirement to make exceptions from generally applicable laws for religious people or entities, and that there has to be strict separation between church and state in the public schools. So those rules were thought to be well settled if you had asked someone around 2000, around 2005. But since that time, the last 20 years or so, those rules have been under serious attack and serious threat. On balance, the protections of the Establishment Clause, the idea that the use of religion by the state ought to be limited, has given way to a more robust conception of the Free Exercise Clause, the idea that people and entities ought to be able to pray or worship in whatever way necessary, even if there is some entanglement with the state. And so all of those rules are under threat. So recall the first rule, that governments could but did not have to include religious individuals and entities in grant programs. That rule is dead. So there have been a series of cases saying that if taxpayer money goes to anyone, it also has to go to similarly situated religious entities. There's a current case before the court called Coercion against Macon. The court has already heard oral argument in. They have not yet written the opinion, but based on how the oral argument went, it is, I would say, overwhelmingly likely that the court is going to require the state of Maine, through its voucher program, to fund religious schools because it funds non-religious ones. And you'll recall that basically the identical issue was in the Ohio case 20 years ago. And the controversy was whether Ohio was allowed to include religious schools in its voucher program. Nobody thought 20 years ago that it was required to include religious schools. So that's sort of an example of the sea change that's gone on these issues, even in just 20 years. Second, recall the rule that generally applicable laws that apply to everyone need not make exceptions for religious entities or individuals. That rule is technically still alive, but it is on metaphorical life support. More and more often, the religious right has been pushing, often successfully, for religious exceptions for rules that apply to everybody. Probably the most obvious examples of that have been around litigation related to COVID. So early in the pandemic, of course, there were capacity restrictions in different buildings. Many churches, synagogues, mosques brought challenges seeking exceptions to those capacity restrictions. The courts sort of split, different lower courts split on whether they granted those exceptions or not. More recently, there's been a ton of challenges to vaccine requirements that, again, apply to everybody in, for example, the Navy or some other branch of the armed services. And again, the courts have split about whether, in one case, the Navy is required to make exceptions for religious objectors to vaccination requirements. So though the lower courts are split on those issues, it has been a walk back from, again, what was previously thought to be a well-settled rule, which was if it applies to everybody, you don't have to make an exception for religious objectors. And then finally, recall that the last rule was that historically, the separation between church and state has been at its highest in the public schools. And that rule is also not immune to the court's increased favoritism of certain kinds of religious exercise. So as Rich mentioned, Americans United was counsel for Bremerton School District in the case that was just heard last Monday, Kennedy against Bremerton School District. It involved a high school football coach in Washington State who is seeking his job back after he involved his students, his players, in prayer for 7 years at the 50-yard line, and demanded to continue praying midfield right after games, even when the school repeatedly offered him accommodations for personal and private prayer. You can tell I'm a little biased on this one. I apologize. I've been working on it for a while. But in any event, the court does appear quite likely to rule for the coach, unfortunately, in my view, unfortunately. And in the process, they very well may rewrite much of the jurisprudence related to coercive prayer in public schools. We'll have to see when the opinion is written, just how much law they overturn, but I think it's a safe bet that at least some law related to the high wall of separation between church and state is going to be overturned. And then, of course, there are other issues that are not technically strictly about the separation of church and state, but where the conservative legal movement has used a certain vision of religion and religious exercise to drive legal pushes to reduce or eliminate rights. For example, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the court has heard a case called Dobbs against Jackson's Women's Health Center, which may overturn Roe against Wade. And of course, the many religious leaders were leaders of the opposition to same-sex marriage before the Obergefell decision legalized same-sex marriage nationwide. So many of the folks, again, sort of on the religious right with a certain view of what religion is, have been driving a lot of what's going on legally in the country for the last 20 years or so. So I finally want to turn to sort of where this is all headed, and what I think is like you're likely to see over the next 10 or 20 years. So I think the big picture is that what Justice Neil Gorsuch actually called in an argument, he called it the quote, so-called separation of church and state. I think it's going to continue to get whittled away, at least for a little while. There's a lot of animus towards the idea that there ought to be strict separation between church and state. You know, in my view and in our organization's view, that matters for everybody, because the more that religion is involved with the state or vice versa, the less certain we can be that our own religious practices won't be influenced by state endorsed ones or state favored ones. And the less ability we have as a democracy to set rules that apply to everybody equally, even to the religious. So, you know, what can be done about it? I'll talk through a couple of things that we're doing on the legal end. So one thing I think you're likely to see is the increased use of the free exercise clause as an argument for why some religious practice can harm others. Historically, you would use the establishment clause to say it represented a state establishment of religion, but many members of the current Supreme Court are pretty hostile to the idea of a robust establishment clause. So for example, in the Kennedy case about the praying coach, we tried to explain that the coercion, when a coach leads students in prayers, it puts pressure on the ability of students with a different prayer practice to freely exercise their own religion, because they have to choose between that and sort of being a member of the team and being, if they don't participate in the coach's practice, they could be alienated, they could fear that their playing time would be reduced. And all of that, we think, represents a free exercise clause violation, not just an establishment clause violation. We're also going to use the state courts a lot. Many state courts and state constitutions are more favorable to the wall of separation between church and state than are the federal courts at the moment. And so we increasingly are bringing many of our cases in state court. But I think outside of the legal strategy, the most important thing is what we can do practically. I think it takes building a coalition of people who are worried about the crumbling wall of separation between church and state. Events like this one, speaking to people who agree with us, speaking to people who don't agree with us, explaining our view that the crumbling wall of separation doesn't just harm the non-religious, but it harms the religious as well. At Americans United, we partner with a lot of religious people and organizations because we constantly want to battle against the narrative that we are hostile to religion. We are not. We simply think that both religion and the state work best when they aren't intertwined. So with that, I want to again say thank you. I'm happy to end my portion of the presentation, although of course I'm sticking around for questions. And I want to turn it over to Rich and to the other panelists so that they have an opportunity to speak. So thank you again.
Thank you, Alex. That was a wonderful presentation, so informative and illuminating. I really appreciate the historical perspective as well as the synopsis of current events. So before we turn it over to our reactor panel, we here at the Community Forum of Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Venice would really just like to thank all of you for coming out today and participating in this important topic. Most of all, we would, of course, love to thank Alex and our reactor panel. Thank you all for taking time out of your Sunday afternoon and being here to talk with all of us. We will be hearing today. You all have a microphone there, so you can, right in the middle. I'll have to make sure it's turned on. Good. So we'll be hearing, and you decide who would like to start, from Pastor McClellan from Hope Ministry, Center of Hope, from Reverend Rao from the Episcopalian Church of Venice, and then Rabbi Shul from the Jewish Congregation of Venice. Okay, so we'll turn it over to you, and then we'll take questions.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for inviting me, and really is an honor to be here. And it's a sort of a weighty task that's before me as I see it. I'm certainly no legal expert. I'm a rabbi from the conservative movement of Judaism, which is sort of the centrist movement, representing again today the Jewish Congregation of Venice, and myself, and I guess the Jewish people. So from that perspective, with all humility that I can muster, I would say that as a minority in this country, and a minority that was beleaguered for centuries, largely by a dominant Christianity that was often intertwined with the state, I would say the vast majority of Jews came to this country with a great sense of appreciation and relief that there was this establishment clause and the free exercise clause. Again, the idea that we could pursue our religious commitments without interference from the state, without oppression from the state. And I don't have to go through the long litany. I hope you're aware of that history of oppression. This was for some, and I think many share this view, this was the new Zion. This was the returning home. Again, I think the First Amendment really was critical. It is the first, right? I got it right. It was critical in that, but it came out of an attitude, obviously, of the establishment of this country in terms of Enlightenment attitudes. So I think that's certainly the view historically of the Jewish community in America. And also it's the view, I think, of the vast majority of Jews today. But I think over the past number of decades, there has been a growing concern in parts of the Jewish community, and I think I've been affected by some of that conversation, that secularization in the larger American society, sort of a completely neutral public space of religion, is not good for the Jewish people. And maybe this is as a result of the success of being an American, success of the flourishing of a prosperous Jewish community. But I think there are some, and again, I'm convinced by some of this concern that if the public space is completely neutral and people are becoming less religious, and certainly I think the clergy up here can attest to the fact that fewer and fewer people are engaged in church or synagogue activities, that again, a hard and fast, which is not exactly what I heard from the speaker, but I think the practical result, and again, the larger context of American society is a decrease in religious knowledge, a decrease in religious behavior, really a lack of awareness of the foundations that are part of American society. We can debate that back and forth in terms of whether the founders were Christian or whether they're deists and so forth. But I think the value system, as it's called, Judeo-Christian value system, again, that's a sort of a term that was thrown on to largely was a Christian value system that Jews were happy to claim some part of, but that's been an important part of American society. And when you lose that rootedness in knowledge of the Bible and knowledge of religious values, there's a consequence, and it's not always a good consequence, I would say, for a lot of people who think that. And I'm convinced by some of those arguments that's a concern. So again, I think that there's some ambivalence now that didn't exist maybe 70, 80 years ago when my parents were in public school and they were dealing with the Lord's Prayer, whatever they had to say in public school, and felt very much probably beleaguered, and certainly saw a change, and a welcome change. But again, because of what we see of the state of larger American culture that is, again, sort of not knowledgeable really of religious ideas, religious values. Now, what role the state has in that, that's a very important question. And that's what I guess we're here to talk about. But I think there's a larger issue at hand here, which is American society and what is the role of religion in American society, whether it's the state giving support of that or not, and what the state's role. But I bring to this a concern about, one, a dominant Christianity. I think there are some on the, I think majority of Jews are concerned about a Christianity that is much more sort of vigorous and trying to, assert more, particularly from, I guess you could say, the Christian right, which seems to be the most aggressive and the most vital in some ways in terms of the amount of people involved, their commitments, their political connections. So there's a concern, as much as I said, of the secularization of American society and what that will mean for our children and for the Jewish future. It also brings fear, I think. Will this again become medieval Europe and a place that Jews will have to cower and not really seen as equals in this society because you have this much more nationalist Christianity emerging. And again, it's kind of tied in with political. Now the Republican Party has sort of been, as over the past number of decades, been part of that growing sort of Christian, muscular Christianity and so forth. So it's complicated. I'll say that. This issue is complicated. It's more than just legal, it's complicated. As people are concerned about the moral future of the country, I think we should do our best to be thoughtful about this and not just have a sort of knee-jerk reaction of, yes, complete separation is the best thing we could all have. But what about the welfare of larger society? Again, I think we have to be, as I say, careful in the way we think about this. And again, this doesn't lend itself towards bumper stickers and the polarization of our society that we see. But I hope you can appreciate the concern of thoughtful people, I would say, on the right. And again, I listen to some of those voices and I share some of those concerns who are not just looking to bludgeon it, but who have true concerns about the welfare of our children and the society that's bereft of religious values. And can the state of religion as it exists with an increasing secularization and the diminishing of mainline churches, can we truly imbue our future? And what is there a role for the state at all in sort of strengthening these mainline organizations with a more sort of reasonable and balanced view of the place of religion in society? So I'll turn it over to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's great to see all of you, I have to tell you. On a Sunday afternoon, it's great to be with all of you. My name is Mike. I'm the rector at St. Mark's Episcopal Church on the island. I've been here I'm going on my second year. And I have to tell you, I think Ben just said a word, it's complicated. Everyone has a role in this and a role to play. We as religious voices and leaders have a role. You all have, a role in this. The attorneys have a role in this as we do this. And I think back many, many years ago where there was a pew tax. People would pay a pew tax and they were required to go to church. Well, we saw that change. Well, we didn't see that because we're not that old. But we saw that change through history. So people weren't made, so to say, to go to church. Throughout history, we've seen churches struggle with how do we reach individuals and families. Fast forward to World War II. And I say that because it was a time in history where individuals and families weren't necessarily going to church on a regular basis. Fast forward to today, the pandemic, every denomination is seeing a decline. Churches are somewhat bucking the trend. They're seeing a rise. What are they doing? And I say all of that in a nutshell of the history because I think too often times excuses come up. Oh, it's because of the separation. It's because we can't pray in school anymore. It's because we can't go into the school anymore. But we have to be creative on how we're reaching individuals and families, knowing what the laws are. We all have our roles to play. We're not the attorneys to fight these cases, but we do have that role to, I don't want to say break in, but to get in. Several years ago when I was in Connecticut, I became really good friends with the high school football coach. And we created this relationship. And he was a faithful man and still is a faithful man. And we knew that I couldn't go onto the field. I mean, I guess I could, but what would that do? I mean, we'd end up in a case. And honestly, I have better things to do with my time than to sit through attorneys questioning and going to, no offense to you, going to court. So what we did was it was all volunteer, and we opened up our church to the football team. So on a Saturday morning before their game, they were welcome to come, and we led them in prayer at the church. So the one Saturday they came, it was the championship game. We saw more and more players coming, and they weren't made to come. And the coach made that very clear to them. And it wasn't him who was advertising, it was some of the players. And the coach did show up. And that day they went on, I have to tell you, they won the state championship. And it had nothing to do with this, right? Well, maybe it did. But I think it's, how do we look for these creative? How do we meet them where they are? At the beginning of the pandemic, when I was in Pennsylvania, I was on a call with our county commissioners, and our bishop in the Diocese of Pennsylvania, he couldn't make that call. He had a more important call to be on, I guess. He was with the governor's office. So he asked me to go on and be with the county commissioners. And they said, listen, we can't tell you what to do, but we are asking you. And I got off the Zoom call with the county commissioners and called the bishop. And it wasn't about how do we stand up to this, but it was more of how do we take care of one another. So it created this new way of, church in that time. So I think it's how do we look, the laws are always going to change. We know that. But it's how do we look for these creative ways to meet them where they are. Trust me, I would love to be in that high school. But it's not going to happen.
Well, we've already had some wonderful responses. And I thank you for sharing what you shared today in regards to church and state. There's one thing that I try to not get involved with. And I choose to not get involved with is because of the fact of what I believe personally. That doesn't mean that I don't support. I do support the cause. And I know that there's a lot that's on the table right now, and there's a lot that's facing the United States of America. And we do have some big decisions, and it's not going to change unless we all come together at the table and that we all agree to talk and we're able to listen to one another, because we all have beliefs. We all have, a cause of what we stand for. To me as a pastor, prayer is very vital and it's very important to me. And I can only say that, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to tell someone else that it needs to be important to them. It's important to me as an individual. And I choose to pray. That's my choice, is to pray. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to tell you that you must pray. Because again, it is a choice. And isn't that what United States of America is about? It is about the freedom of speech and freedom of choice. There are some serious things that we're going to have to, as a country, that we're going to have to decide and we're going to have to be involved in. And I think one of the reasons that, and not because I want to get into the political side of things, but it's a fact of that we've chosen ignorance. Because many people today don't even know about what is happening in our lawmakers and the laws that are coming in front of us. I have a personal issue when it comes to prayer in school. And I shared that with Lee Carmody in regards to, I was born in 1960. So when I was in 1965 and I was in school, I did have a teacher that was a praying teacher. And I remember that they had not at that time, whether they were supposed to have not prayed, I didn't know that. I was never told that. But I do know that as a result of that teacher at that time, that if it wasn't for her and it wasn't for her leading prayer, I would not be here today. Because that became a safe place for me to go because of the things that was going on in my own home. So because of that, I was able to actually, because of that, there was some grounding that took place, and I felt safe when I went to school. Now, Lee expressed a different scenario to me in regards to her children not praying, and that they didn't pray. And so when they went to school, that they, that this was something that they were forced into. And so I heard her side of that. And it really compelled me, because again, we should have that freedom of how we're going to express ourselves. Our church is non-denominational. Okay, so we do not claim to be a religion. Religion is man-made, but I do believe to serve my God. That's my choice. And I lead people to that every single day. I do believe in the Bible. I do believe in the principles of the Bible. That's my choice. But am I going to say that that's your choice? You have to make that choice. You have to make the choice for your family. Each family should be able to have a choice in the matter of what they believe. And for me and my family, we believe in the principles of prayer. That might not be what you believe, but it's what I believe. And I think it all comes down to a choice. And right now, there's going to be many choices, as the attorney spoke to us about. And there's many choices that we're going to have to decide as a nation. And together, I pray that we can come and have a common ground of unity, that we can all come together and discuss these issues to move forward.
Thank you. We're off to a start with a lot of compelling thoughts, right? So many interesting ideas and positions to explore and share. We'd love to open it up to questions from the audience. I'll come around with the microphone. I'm going to circle around to the front. I saw this gentleman first.
Thank you. Thank you for this forum. I appreciate the discussion. My name is Joseph Fenty. I'm the president of the secular community of Southwest Florida. And I have a number of concerns, first of which is the coercion aspect of prayer in school. It's not an individual taking the time to connect with their God. It is forcing a group of students that may represent many different points of view, from being agnostic, atheists, all up and down the spectrum of religiosity, now being forced to participate in a service, in a prayer that will then be the basis for parceling out privileges. A coach determines who plays first on the team. A coach determines the time that the player gets. These things can all be contingent on falling in line with the coach's prayer, which doesn't seem reasonable to me. If the coach wants to pray, I have no problem with that at all. But in this context, that's a problem for me. The coercion, being forced. I'm sorry. The other thing that I'm concerned about is the spending of public money to support religious institutions. That kind of bothers me because I'm a secular person and I don't like vouchers being spent in religious schools. If you look at science education, if you look at reproductive or sex education, these things are not taught well in religious schools. It's just absolutely horrible. The science education is very watered down. It's based on religious ideas that don't make any sense. That's not scientific. And I think students are being miseducated, and they are not being prepared to function well in a world that requires people to know technology, people to know science, people to know critical thinking. These are all really important. And what we're doing is, especially in Florida, is we're condemning a whole generation of students to religious education in many aspects that distorts their thinking, that crimps their thinking, that distorts their ability to use critical thinking. The other thing that I want to mention is LGBT and women's rights. Okay, so we have the rise of religious fundamentalism. In the United States, we have the evangelical Christians who actually rushed the Capitol, participated in an insurrection, and when they got into those spaces, what did they do? They offered prayer, right? Because they thought that they were being blessed by God to overturn the nation, overturn our Constitution. So, you know, there's a point, and we're at that point now where religious ideas can motivate people to be anti-democratic. And there is this tension between religion and democracy that has to be resolved. And if we're going to live in a pluralistic society where many people of many different ideas and faiths can coexist, we have to create that space. And those are the challenges that I think lie before us.
We want to, I mean, I'd like to react. I'm not sure if you're going to tell me you're going to take it.
Yes, please.
How do you want to handle it?
Go ahead, please react. He has his own mic.
Okay, what's your name again? Hi, Joseph. I agree with some of what you have to say. I think you're incorrect in some of what you had to say in terms of your view of religious education. I know in the Jewish world, there's a whole spectrum of religious schools. My children all went to Jewish schools. They were taught science very well. They were taught history very well. And your depiction of religious private education, I think, is somewhat distorted by what we see in some of the, I guess, more fundamentalist world. Now, should those schools get vouchers, like my children's school, which is one of the, was one of the premier schools in various areas in which we lived, and certainly all the kids got an excellent secular education, as well as a deepened appreciation of their own values and their own Jewish traditions. So I would encourage, and I think what we have here, Joseph, is a need for further conversation, because though I hear you and I agree with some of your concerns, I think we clearly are talking over each other, because you're not describing, what you're describing is not my children's experience or my experience of what a religious education is. So I think that there is a whole world of, certainly since the 1800s, of an integration, I would say, in my tradition, even going back much further, a much more humanistic religious tradition, not always, and we struggle internally between Jews about how to have a more humanistic, and we call it enlightened religious education, but it certainly exists. So again, I think what you just gave evidence to was a need for further conversation about what the nature of religious education. Doesn't mean that the question of vouchers shouldn't be raised, but again, I think it just shows there's a need for further information for all of us. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Larry Rodner. I actually happen to belong to Joe's organization and go there. My question really is an exception case again. Why was it established so long ago that religious organizations did not have to pay taxes? Isn't that an exception that the Supreme Court had ruled states don't have to exempt? And it just seems like, I don't know, so unconstitutional to me. It seems kind of like to me that these huge organizations are getting away for free. They don't have to pay taxes, where we have to then end up supporting them. Basically, they're allowed all the services of other citizens, in terms of support of roads, streets, police, everything. They're not paying anything for this.
Thank you. Responses?
I can offer a technical legal response if that's helpful, which is that churches and synagogues and mosques and other places of worship are categorized as nonprofit entities by statute. I think a statute that's existed since the late 1800s, if my memory serves, although I could have that wrong. And so like other nonprofits, they're exempt from certain federal income taxes. Whether or not they ought to be categorized that way, I suppose is a matter of debate, but that's how the Congress has categorized places of worship, and so sort of carved them in. So it's less of a First Amendment issue and more of a Congress has passed a law saying this. There are other exceptions that I was speaking at a high level when I gave my presentation about exceptions. There are other exceptions to rules that churches and other places of worship enjoy. For example, they're able to hire and fire ministers of the faith without respect to anti-discrimination laws. And that actually makes some sense when you think about the fact that anti-discrimination laws prevents anyone from discriminating on the basis of religion. So it would be odd if, for example, a synagogue, to take my own faith, couldn't hire someone because they were Jewish. Of course, a synagogue can do that. But it does mean also that they can hire or fire someone for any other reason that normally would be prohibited by anti-discrimination laws. So for example, someone could be fired because she's a woman, or because she's Black, or because she's gay. So that is an exception that churches and other places of worship enjoy, but only with respect to their ministers of the faith. So that's sort of a big one, along with the tax exemptions. I'm not sure how much clarity that lends, but just a couple of points on it.
Thank you. Other questions?
My name is Ann Harrison. I have been a participant, an active participant in religion since the day I was born. I was born into a fundamental Protestant religion that told me that as a girl, I was less than. And as I came of age as a lesbian, I was damned to hell. My religion has evolved to a point where I have found my way to this wonderful congregation. I joke that I am a humanist in the winter and a congregational Christian in the summer when I return to Massachusetts. I want us to remember that just as we are polarized politically in this country, every religion I have ever experienced has had extremes. And you can think of it as the right and the left. You can think of it as the zealots. You can think of it as the closed-minded and the open-minded. But that is precisely why religion has no place in our schools. I don't know anything about this football coach in Washington State, but if he prayed the way that I have been prayed over in my lifetime, it is wrong. It is against God. It is against any interpretation of what we as humans deserve. So if it is a prayer that demeans, excludes, judges, discriminates, we cannot risk that our children will be subjected to that. If it is a prayer that celebrates unity, diversity, we can't take a chance and say that anyone who feels compelled to pray in school over our children has a right to do that, because some of these prayers are evil and they are destructive, and they tell our children that they are unworthy, that they are less than, that they are inferior, that they are damned, and it's just not right.
Any responses from our panel?
Thank you. You are a beloved child of God, and I'm so sorry what you had to go through, but I thank God that you are here in this place and found a place. And I agree with you. There is so much crap out there on how folks pray, and that is a big fear of mine. of what are we allowing others to hear. So thank you for saying it.
Thank you.
It's great being a wife. Hi, my name is Pam Palmer. My concern here is that we keep talking about religion, and I don't think this issue really is about religion. I think it's about people who use religion just to control people who don't believe what they believe. And I think people often join religions not because of this great love of the God that they're talking about, but because they need to find people who think they do, make them feel bigger so they can make others feel smaller.
Thank you. Panel, any responses or reactions? Okay, we'll move on.
Thank you. I'm the lesser half, apparently. I have two questions. One is I've been told that the most effective arguments when this came up in the Supreme Court was coming from Justice Gorsuch. Is that right? Neil Gorsuch, yes. Is that correct? As a former football coach?
If you're referring to the Kennedy, the praying coach case, I think I heard you say, and I'm sorry, the sound is not great, but I think he said the most effective arguments. I certainly he was engaged with both sides, including my boss Richard, who was arguing for the school district. I think Justice Kavanaugh is a coach currently. He coaches his. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear. I see you talking, but I just can't hear.
You can finish. I apologize for speaking.
Oh, no problem. Anyhow, he is a coach, and he spoke a lot to both sides about the coercive power of coaches, what many people have brought up.
Do you think it's going to translate into a vote?
Do I think it's going to translate into a vote? I can't confidently say I do. I think if you read the news articles about the argument, they say that it appeared that 5 or more justices were leaning towards the coach. So that would include Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Gorsuch, all of the more traditionally thought to be the conservative justices, except perhaps for Justice Roberts. And then the 3 more liberal justices seem to be leaning towards the school district, but that would still not be enough. That would be 4. So, we're hopeful. We certainly thought a lot about what Justice Kavanaugh knows because he is a coach, and I think he gets that what coaches do matters to kids. And we're hopeful that as he thinks about the issue, he'll be convinced by that. But I don't want to put the cart before the horse, so to speak.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Miss
Barbara Smith. One thing I'm concerned about is government money going to religious organizations. And I got into this when I was writing COVID grant, because I know sitting here in this church, I could never imagine even suggesting that we go after COVID money. And then I got into writing the grant and realized how many churches got COVID money, and some really did abuse the system. And I wondered what your reaction to that is.
Thank you. Panel? And Alex?
Are you referring to the PPP loan? Yeah.
I was just going to say, I believe the Jewish Congregation of Venice did apply for it. I don't think we abused it, but that's beyond my pay grade fully. trusting the lay people to make sure that those things are done, having looked at the budget on occasion. But yeah, I mean, that's, I guess I'd want to, the problem, I think the challenge we have is we're talking about the law. And then as I was saying, I think you heard here on the panel, there's a larger issue of societal well-being. And we've heard about what true religion is versus those who want to just manipulate others. And I agree that certainly that's evident that we see. And though this, frankly, I'll say this, I don't know if this is controversial and maybe it's not fully true, but I'll throw it out there. I think this is more largely a Christian problem than it is a Jewish or, well, we see in the Muslim world, it's a Muslim, you know, the place of Islam in the larger world is certainly something that is a challenge. And it's been a challenge for this country. It's a challenge, obviously, for Europe. But let's leave Islam aside. We don't have an imam here. But, you know, I think the challenge is ultimately for Christianity. I mean, we're sort of players in this a little bit. We're minority players, very small. We may have people involved who are voices like the good attorney here. But you know, the question I think for Christianity, I would say, again, this takes it into a theological realm and not because I think I heard in my friend Mike's comments, I would like to be in the high school. And you didn't really elaborate why. I assume it's because you feel the kids need to hear the message that you want to convey, or it should be part of the.
We're Episcopalians. We don't do that.
You don't do that? Oh, okay. So you tell me, but again, I'll just get back to the issue of, I think it's Christianity's challenge, I'll say theologically, is what is the role of spreading the gospel? And where are the limits? And how do you deal with that? Because, you know, long ago, someone named Constantine took over, you know, became the Christian church, the Roman emperor, and you had that problem of power, you, and not us. We had our own problems. But we suffered from that merger of church and state under Constantine, the Roman emperor, and the good and the bad. And for us, sadly, it was largely bad that came as a result of that. But so there's that issue of power and how do you use power as Christians. Obviously, this is a somewhat new experiment for Christianity in America, and to some degree doesn't really parallel in other Western democracies. Canada doesn't exactly operate like this. There are religious ministries, I believe. They do fund religious schools. Israel certainly does, and it is a Western democracy, but has a different, England is different, has an official church, and that hasn't completely fallen apart either. There's some issues challenged. So there are other models that exist in Western democracies other than ours. I don't know if religion is any better shape there. I don't think it necessarily is. And again, as I do think this is a problem for Christianity, and a theological problem is, and what you hear, judging people at least on their word from the religious right, is we're following our religious convictions, which is to spread the gospel. So again, I think this is in some ways more your problem. It's my problem too, but to some degree, you're more in charge of where you want to go with this issue. And I realize, and how you're going to get your family together, your Christian family, because that's where the larger fight is than in the minority communities and the majority. So I'll throw it back to you guys.
Thank you.
Right. Well, that's the question of law, as we heard, not necessarily establishment, as our Alex had said. So that's not in the Constitution. That was legal laws that were passed about exemptions for churches, right? As far as taxes. I can see you're agitated, so I want to hear. Well, but here's where I guess that's my point. To limit this has echoes. This has a greater societal concern. This is, I don't call it a symptom, but this is an issue, part of a larger issue of the place of religion and certainly the history of, I'll say, Christianity in the Western world. Why, as I started by saying, Jews came to this country as a breath of fresh air because there was a new way of relating to religion and the power of the state that had existed since Constantine's time, at least in the Western world, of the religion and state were the same. It's expressed in the Constitution, but I think I've raised two larger issues. What is the result of a sort of a neutral public ground, a secularized public ground, that to me as a religious leader is a concern. As my colleague said, he's finding other ways to get that message across, kind of working with, around, I guess, the First Amendment concern. So again, yeah, there is the narrow, I don't call it narrow, it's a big issue, but there's a larger issue, the good of society. And I've thrown it back as a Christian issue because I think, to me, it's an interest to me as a Jew. What is the theological role of spreading the gospel? Because I think that's what really motivates a lot of the people who want to bring down the so-called wall between church and state. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think it's a broader and I think a much more interesting conversation than just constitutionality and law. It's a question of what do we want for our society, and there's a theological aspect of this as well. Does that answer your question? Okay. No, I don't think it's the issue. I think it's a larger issue. It is one of the issues, but I think it's a larger issue, and that's why I threw it out as a Christian issue, because this is still a majority Christian country, and I think what we're hearing is the walls being kind of eroded by Christians. So it's not by, there are some Jews who are doing it, some of them may be ultra-Orthodox and so forth, but and there's a fear, I guess, in the world from some about Islam and its role, or concern, shall we say, not as much in this country, but in Europe. You see it in France with laws banning women from wearing burqas and hijabs and so forth. So that's a Western country that believes in separation. But so it's a larger international issue and cultural issue.
Thank you, Rabbi. We have a question here.
My name's Ksenia, and I almost have a sense like we're talking around things, but we're not addressing the elephant in the room, and that's the change that has happened in the United States in terms of mutual respect and morality and religion, and the use of religion not for positive goals, but to put others down over the last 6 years or 5 years. And I think that, to me, is a really major issue and very, very frightening, because as I'm reading the paper and as I'm listening to news and seeing what's happening, it seems like there's a push to keep going that way. And I'm an immigrant. I was not born in this country, and I treasure the democracy here and the freedom of speech and respect. And I'm just frightened by what I'm seeing. And I think that needs to be addressed in terms of what's happening here.
Thank you. Any responses? Right. Richard? Right.
Couple of comments that might tie some things together. I'm sorry. You had your hand up first. I'm sorry.
My name is Jean Mosby. I am a Christian. I believe the Bible is the inspired word of God, but I interpret that scripture differently than a lot of my conservative friends. My concern is that my conservative Christian friends are reaching deep into the legislature of our state and telling me that the way they interpret the Bible is the way I have to interpret the Bible. It is the way I have to believe about sexual issues. It's the way I have to believe about the women's right to control what happens in her body. This is a real concern for me, as how deeply they are reaching into the legislative process.
Thoughts?
It is a deep concern, especially watching the way people treat one another. And it's, I mean, we're to respect the dignity of every human being. And how do we have that conversation when we're met with resistance or, no, this is definitely going to be the way it is, and I'm going to tell you the way it is. I hold my faith close. And I'm a deep man of faith, and I pray, but I know everybody doesn't pray. But I think it just shows how much this world, whether you have the faith or not, we need kindness and love. Because it is scary. It is scary. And going back to a comment, because the rabbi brought it up when I made that brief little comment at the end where I said about, oh, I'd love to be in the schools. Don't get me wrong. Episcopalians do not preach from the street corner. That's not who we are. And I think it's more of just the presence, this presence of this collar right here. I'm worried about, society, and I have kids and I watch them growing up, and no one is immune to this because we are met with that resistance. Sometimes it's hate-filled too.
Well, as you said, we do need love.
Thanks, the husband again. I am concerned that as an atheist, I'm not hearing any good messages from anybody here. And that bothers me. If the churches in the United States don't figure out that this is something they ought to be coming out against very strongly, what you're going to have here is the same thing that you have in Europe. Okay, you'll be around as ministers to handle the 3 times that people come into the church in their life. And at the end of that, the ones that have good buildings will be tourist destinations. Now, I've seen it happen. You can go to Ireland, you can go to England, you can go just about any place. And I'm not hearing that you've got to see that your survival depends on this. And maybe giving us a little bit of a break occasionally as atheists who represent the majority of people in the world. And probably close to the majority of people in the United States.
Thank you, Richard.
Hold on, it just needs some clarification because you weren't specific. One, who represents the majority? You didn't say atheists, is that what you're saying? Okay, all right.
China.
Pardon me?
Russia. China.
China and Russia.
Sweden.
That's concerning to you, or that's a good thing, or that's just a statement of fact?
It's a statement of fact.
Because how many of people in China have been given the option of having opportunity to have a free expression of religion? Not many, because that's a society that is.
There's still the majority atheists.
That doesn't, but the tyranny of the majority. All right, I think you'd have the tyranny. I don't want Chinese people and their moral sensibility running the world because they just happen to be forced to be atheists. So we can have a conversation about that. But
They weren't Marxist.
okay, all right. Just wanted to make that clear.
Okay, thanks.
I find myself wavering from one view to another a little bit here, and I just wanted to bring something up and try to see if there's some agreement. And that my wife and I have friends that are Mormon witnesses of Jehovah that have somewhat more extreme views religiously. I think we've known Jewish people and Christians all of our lives. And a couple of weeks ago, there was a wonderful seminar, a Zoom meeting on science deniers. And I think if we're sticking with scientific issues and not spiritual and religious, the scientific method is a wonderful way to sort out things that are false and are not. We have a lot of problems in the country right now, I think, with people that are denying science for political purposes. But the people that I know that are Mormons and Witnesses of Jehovah are wonderful people. And yet I can't agree with their beliefs. And I think I just have to shut off any criticism of what they believe in personally. And I ask them to do the same for me. And I don't see anything around that. I wish that children could be exposed to different religions the way Venice Interfaith Community Association has people meeting each other. And I know some of you are involved in that, but I don't see practically how we can do that with the conflict of government in programs for children, telling parents, doing things that would be in conflict with their parents. It seems like ideally, if children could be brought up to respect other people with different religious beliefs, it'd be wonderful, but I can't see how it can happen with the political situation we have.
Thank you.
May I say something in response to that, if you can still hear me? I switched to headphones. I just want to clarify, I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, I went to Hebrew school and what we call Sunday school, which we stole from the Christians until I was bar mitzvahed, and actually for a couple of years after my bar mitzvah. And one of the things that we did was we visited a mosque, we visited a Baptist church, we visited a Catholic church. I don't think we ever went to a Unitarian church, but I probably had friends who were Unitarians. So, we got that education through my religious schooling that was separate from the public school education that I was getting. But it's also perfectly appropriate in my view, and it's perfectly legal, I just want to say, to educate about religion. In other words, to talk about the history of religion, to talk about what different religions believe. That is completely legal. And sometimes people get that confused with prayer in schools, which obviously is more controversial. And we've heard different perspectives on that. And that's something that certainly organizationally and personally, I am opposed to. But I want to be clear that the kind of interreligious dialogue in terms of understanding what different religions believe, not only can, but in my view, should be taught in schools, because as you say, that's important for children to understand. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Great, thank you.
Alex, I have a question for you. I find it very confusing with this coach situation. We are saying that basically this one coach can then make his football players, and I was a football player, so I know how important coaches are, but how is his rights over everybody else's rights? I've been wondering for a long time that we have become a country of vocal minorities, where we seem to be run by very small, loud minorities. When I say that, I'm talking religious minorities more than anything else. But I just don't understand how there's an argument with this coach whatsoever. How does he have a right to pray over his football players, whatever religion he happens to be? I don't care what religion it is. How does he have that right over those players?
Well, in some sense, you're asking the wrong guy because I think he doesn't. But what I will say, I want to be fair to Coach Kennedy. He never required students to participate in the sense of, if you don't come pray with me, you don't get to play, or I'm gonna, talk to your parents or something like that. But many students nonetheless said, I felt like I was coerced, I was pressured to participate. And that seems odd unless you've ever met a high school football player, in which case it makes total sense, because that's what you want to do. You want to please the coach. He's the one who is determining sort of, you're standing on the team, you've got friends who are doing it, you don't want to be an outcast, all that stuff. We think that kind of coercion, even though Coach Kennedy never said, I'm going to punish you if you don't show up, we think that's wrong. Now, you can see the other side of the argument, right? You can see the other side. Well, what Coach Kennedy would say, what his attorney said is, look, a lot of kids enjoyed it. It's his religious practice that he should be allowed to participate in. He never threatened to revoke or did revoke, playing time or any other thing like that. So, you can see that side of the argument. Again, in my view, it's still wrong when a coach is leading students in prayers, because it does in this case, there were students who said, I felt pressured to pray in violation of my own conscience, because that's not how I pray as a religious minority, or I don't normally pray because I'm an atheist. But again, you can see the other side of it. I want to be fair to that side. I don't know if that totally answers your question, but that's a little more detail.
Thanks, Alex.
I want to make a comment that's going to cut across a couple of strains of comments that are going on. And Alex, I invite you to correct me on the legal aspect of this. On the education, the gentleman made some comments about secular education. Teachers are afraid in many instances to teach evolution, okay, because they are afraid of what the religious right is going to say. And I'm going to reference a case in York, Pennsylvania, where the school board said, we have to teach creationism to the students alongside evolution. And they were sued by a group, and I'm not making this up because if you Google what I'm about to say, you're going to see it. They were sued by the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. And that is no joke. And they said that if you were going to say that a Christian God or a God created the world, then you have to give our church equal time. And we belong to the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. And if you Google it, you'll find a gospel of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. You will find a whole series of religious articles, and you can buy anything connected with the church. The bigger point being is that if you open up the door, you break down the wall of separation, you open up the door to religion taking over, okay, a particular religion. For example, there are 5 different versions of the 10 Commandments. There are 7 or 8 different Bibles. Which one are they going to use? People get nervous because they want the 10 Commandments taken out of the public square, or that there has to be a Christmas, you have to take down a Christmas. Suppose the Church of Satan said, I want to put right next to a nativity scene, I want to put a statue to Baphomet. And this is why the wall of separation is important, is that it protects everybody. There are over 2,300 Christian denominations in the United States simply because there was a wall protecting everybody. But if you tear down the wall and one is supreme, one group takes over, then you run the risk of anybody putting their thoughts in on our laws. Alex, was I correct about the York, Pennsylvania one?
Yes, you were. Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. And you see that a lot actually in the Coach Kennedy case. There was a group of Satanists that said, well, if he's praying on the field, we're going to come down to the field. And so, it caused this whole ruckus. So that sort of thing is not unusual in these kinds of legal cases.
Thank you both. Any last questions? Okay, I see a couple of new hands. And panel, feel free to jump in if you ever want.
I'm Jackie Whitus. I just want to say how much I have appreciated and learned from this presentation, so thank you all. I think there is another subject that might be a topic for future forums, and that is that we seem to look at others' religions in the extreme. You know, we don't seem to have the view of the majority, and I was that way myself when I was a Catholic growing up. I remember the first time that my parents ever objected to something the church said was when we were told not to go to the Episcopal Church fair. And at that point, they said, no, wait a minute, we can't do that. But I married a Jew, and our extended family has if they were here today, they would have gone to each of your congregations this morning, as well as come to the Unitarian Church. And so one thing I have really learned is not all Baptists are extremists. You know, my 26-year-old beloved grandson is a Baptist, and a very serious Baptist. And his religion is just as valuable and as meaningful and as comforting to him as it is to me. So I think we need a greater understanding, and to see how we don't say, well, so-and-so is coming from this church, maybe we all ought to wear bulletproof vests, you know? I mean, I think we ought to have a conversation as to how we can lower the temperature between religions and understand that we're all just trying to bring out the best in people. Thank you.
Because I don't really think it's that religions are fighting with one another. I think the politicians have taken a very strong side, particularly the Christian nationalists. And that is what is, you know, they're affecting the legislation in this country. The Supreme Court now has been stacked pretty conservatively, and are all the gains that were made previously to allow more freedom going to disappear? I'm fearful that they are. So I think religions and different religions have a great place in this country. They should be here. I mean, that's what this country was founded on, religious freedom. People came from different countries to practice their own religion freely. But once they get control of state legislatures, that's when the trouble has started. And we have to be very knowledgeable about what is happening. We have to vote with intelligence, and we have to understand what is happening to our democracy. We are being greatly oppressed by this Christian nationalism. There was a New York Times article a couple of months ago where the Christian evangelists have now substituted you know who for Jesus Christ. Thank you.
He who shall not be named.
Thank you. Thoughts before we take another question? Yes, go ahead.
I very much appreciate being here, appreciate inviting me, and obviously there's some emotion here appropriately. There's fear, there's a sense of commitment to America and what it stands for, and that's what makes this, I think, an engaging conversation, an important one. I'll end by saying I am certainly supportive personally of the First Amendment, the way it's been interpreted by our courts, a separation of church and state. I am a graduate of the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, who's come through some appropriate criticism in recent years, but the wall of separation certainly, I think, on the whole, has been a positive thing, and I support it. I wouldn't say on the other hand, and as a religious leader in this country, I believe that religion is not only about the personal beliefs of individuals. It is about what grounds society. It should have an important voice along with our atheist friends, and I would love to engage in a conversation about the source of ethical beliefs and relativism versus absolutism. We have to have those conversations. But I do believe, and I trust, tell me if you think differently, that you would agree that this is not, religion is not only about private, it is about, to some degree, the public values, and it should have a voice, an important voice in shaping those public values, because there are certain things as societal values, and what should they be based on. So, and again, it's complicated. This is a complicated issue, and it is more than just about the Constitution, and it's more, and I would be interested in I threw out a challenge to my Christian friends, they didn't respond, maybe for another conversation, but the theological question of what does it mean to spread the gospel? I think there is some challenge, and at least that's what I'm hearing from the Christian right. They're just acting on their religious impulse. And so I'm interested in that, maybe for a follow-up conversation. So.
Great, thank you. We've got time for maybe one or two more. I did see your hand up, and then I'd like to give the mic back to Rich for a couple closing comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a quick question for Alex. I don't know if you're familiar with Andrew Seidel. He's a scholar or a lawyer from the Freedom from Religion Foundation. He wrote a book called The Founding Myth, where he sort of takes apart this argument that America was founded as a Christian nation, and it's amazing the quotes from all the founders and the stories and the treaties that sort of explain the religious context during the period. Now, the conservative judges say they're originalists and contextualists, whatever. How are they going to thread that argument? I know you don't privy to their chambers, but how do you think they're going to, come up, just discard the stare decisis, the precedent, and form something totally new? What's going to be the line of argument in your best guess?
So there's a couple of questions. So let me start. So first of all, I know Andrew very well. We actually just hired him from the Freedom from, we just hired him from FFRF. He now works for Americans United. So he's my colleague. So I know Andrew quite well. He's a great guy. And I know, he knows way, way more about the history of this stuff than I do. In terms of the court and how they're going to reach a decision, I think it's hard to say just how far they will go. I think what is true is that if Coach Kennedy does end up winning, it could be a very narrow decision that just he has laid out facts that we think are not accurate, but that he says that by the end of his time praying, he just wanted to pray by himself. I think that all of the evidence shows that that's not accurate, but the court may buy that and then say, because he was just praying by himself, he's entitled to do that. That would be a narrow ruling, right? That would distinguish it from prior decisions that said that coaches and teachers can't pray with students. So it's sort of an odd thing where if they buy the other side's version of the facts, it's actually potentially a more narrow ruling. It could be broader. They could just say, we don't care about the prior decisions that we said teachers and coaches couldn't pray to students. Yes, he was praying to students, and that's okay. And you mentioned the word stare decisis, which is the idea that the court usually stands by prior decisions, but they don't always stand by prior decisions. This has been a big point of controversy with Roe against Wade, because they may overturn that decision. So sometimes they do overturn prior decisions, and the court may just forthrightly say, we got it wrong before, and we think it's okay that coaches and teachers pray with students. I don't want to wager a guess on which of those they'll go with. I'm hopeful that if we lose, it will be a narrow ruling. And I think there's reason to hope that. And then the last part of your question was, about originalism, which is the idea that the Constitution means what it meant at the time it was enacted. And given all of the skepticism from some of the founders about religion, how could it be that the Constitution approves of or allows for official religious practice? And I think, that's something that we've argued often to the court in a variety of cases. We talk about the founders' views on religion. There was a diversity of views. We talk about laws that existed at the time that barred, for example, compelled support for churches. So I do think there's a lot in the founding generation, and if you look at the history, that shows that even at that time there was significant separation between church and state. Historians on the other side point to other things, and sort of which version of history you buy can sometimes determine the outcomes of the cases. And obviously, there are now more justices on the Supreme Court who have a different version of what history was at that time. That's sort of the nicest way I can put it.
Does any members of our panel have any final comments they'd like to make? No. I want to thank everybody for coming. First of all, I want to thank you, Alex. I appreciate your taking the time. I want to thank each of our panelists. I know that all of you had kind of competing things, and I really, really appreciate, you're taking the time to share your thoughts with us. And I thank all of you for coming. If anyone has any ideas about what topics they would like us to address, please let us know. Again, this is an experiment, and I'm pretty pleased the way it worked out. If anybody is interested in Americans United for Separation of Church and State, there are some applications outside. There's also some water bottles. Please feel free to take them. And again, thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Rich. This was great.